Vice Chairman Bruce Landsberg, Landsberg. Board Member Earl Weener, Weener, PhD. And Board Member Jennifer Homendy, HOM as in Mike, EN as in November, DY. Their official photos and biographies are available on the NTSB website at ntsb.gov/about/ and then click on Board Members. We'll start our event promptly at 10 o'clock. I'll introduce the panel, and then Chairman Sumwalt will provide some opening remarks, and he will unveil the 2019-2020 Most Wanted List of Transportation Safety Improvements. Following his remarks, we'll have a moderated panel discussion with all of our board members to delve into each of the items on the Most Wanted list. Following the panel discussion, we will conduct a question and answer session. We'll have some microphones in the audience for you since we are live streaming and going live on C-SPAN. Please go to the microphone, wait for me to recognize you, and when I do, please tell us who you are, who you're affiliated with, and who on the panel your question is for. When we complete the question and answer session, we're going to debut the 2019-2020 Most Wanted List video. That will also be available along with all of our brochures, booklets, and fact sheets on the NTSB website, and the video will be available on our YouTube channel. Are there any questions about the flow show? All right, we'll start promptly at 10 o'clock. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the National Transportation Safety Board's 2019-20
may mean that we will not be able to accurately determine the probable cause. Since our investigations result in safety recommendations designed to correct deficiencies noted in the investigation, honestly, I worry that due to the government shutdown-related delay in our getting on scene, we may have lost potential life-saving information. One of the most difficult things that we do at the NTSB is to meet with family members, grieving family members, often within hours of their learning the devastating news. The only consolation that I think I've ever been able to offer is that it's our commitment to try to find out what happened so that people don't have to go through what they are going through. But because of the shutdown, we possibly will not have those answers that they need. And that in itself is tragic. In 2017, nearly 39,000 people died in transportation accidents and crashes, with more than 37,000 people dying in our nation's roadways. That's about 107 fatalities each and every day. That's about the number of people that are in this room this morning. Think about this. Everybody in this room, not here tomorrow. Now, I flew airplanes for a living. I was an airline pilot in a former life. I flew a Boeing 737. I flew a Airbus A320. Both of those are the workhorses of the industry. If you take the number of fatalities that we have in this country each year, that's equivalent to having an airplane the size of an A320 or the airplane the size of a Boeing 737, losing 5 of those each week. 5. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. Can you imagine? Where's the social outrage? There should be social outrage because of that. There would be. But where's the social outrage because of the rest of the fatalities that occur in our nation's transportation system? Progress on such unfinished business. That is why we are here. That's the purpose of the NTSB's Most Wanted list. Today, we are here to share the lessons that we've learned from far too many transportation tragedies. Today, we are here to ensure that the action is taken on safety recommendations to prevent accidents and crashes. It's about forward progress in taking paper recommendations and turning those into lives saved. The 2019-2020 Most Wanted list promotes several safety recommendations that can and should be implemented during the next 2 years. It also features broad, long-standing safety issues that still threaten the safety of the traveling public. So, here is the grand reveal of the NTSB's 2019-2020 Most Wanted list. Eliminate distractions. Distractions, they come in all forms. And anything that takes the driver's attention away from the driving task is dangerous. We love these things. We love our personal electronic devices. We can't do without them. They're commonplace. And the distractions from these devices is commonplace. It must be addressed. End alcohol and other drug impairment in transportation. Each year, more than 10,000 people die in highway crashes related to alcohol impairment. And that doesn't even include those related to drug impairment. Seriously? We must do better, and we can do better. Ensure the safe shipment of hazardous materials. When hazardous materials are shipped, they must be transported in a manner that ensures the safety of the surrounding communities and those who provide transportation. We have 45 recommendations that are still outstanding in this issue, which are intended to improve safety. Let's get them done. Fully implement positive train control. 1 year ago today, we had investigators in Casey, South Carolina, investigating a train wreck that happened earlier that morning. An Amtrak train was diverted into a siding where a standing CSX freight train was. This was a PTC preventable accident. Both crew members of the Amtrak train died. That was 7 weeks after an Amtrak train hurtled off the track in DuPont, Washington, claiming 3 lives. Yes, these events, like the 150 or so before it, are accidents that are PTC preventable. PTC has been mandated by Congress, but there has been delay after delay in fully implementing this life-saving technology. Each day that we go without PTC, we are at risk for another PTC preventable accident. Implement a comprehensive strategy to reduce speeding-related accidents. Well, this may sound not very profound, but it's true. Speeding kills. It's a factor in more than 10,000 deaths each year on our roadways. That's a third of all highway crashes are speeding. A third of all highway fatalities are speeding related. Improve the safety of Part 135 aircraft flight operations. Part 135 involves air tours, medical flights, on-demand charter flights. Although many Part 135 flights operate with very high levels of safety, the NTSB accident investigations have highlighted that Part 135 operators aren't required to meet some of the same stringent safety regulations that are required for air carriers operating under Part 121. Think about this. Should there be a different level of safety for paying passengers? Install collision avoidance technology in all new highway vehicles. Collision avoidance systems can prevent and mitigate the severity of crashes. In fact, collision avoidance systems could save nearly 1,000 lives each year. Why are these systems not standard equipment in all newly manufactured vehicles? Our crash investigations and safety studies highlight that they should be standard equipment. Reduce fatigue-related accidents. It's estimated that fatigue played a role in 90,000 highway crashes in 2015, but the NTSB has investigated accidents in all transportation modes that involve fatigue. So, can anything be done about fatigue in transportation? Can it? You bet it can. We have 42 outstanding safety recommendations related to fatigue, and they need to be implemented. Quite simply, we are tired of fatigue in transportation. Require medical fitness. As a result of our accident and crash investigations, we've repeatedly called for obstructive sleep apnea screening. The FRA and the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration initiated rulemaking to require such screening. But do you know what happened? Nothing happened, because in August of 2017, they pulled that rulemaking effort back, and that is unacceptable, because until there's such screening and treatment for operators, people will continue to die because of obstructive sleep apnea. Strengthen occupant protection. Well, there's been a debate over the years. Should school buses have seat belts? Well, let's put an end to that debate right here and now. The NTSB believes that school buses should be equipped with lap shoulder belts. We also need window glazing and improved roof strength on motor coaches, along with greater crashworthiness standards for passenger rail cars. In wrapping up the overview of the NTSB's 2019-2020 Most Wanted list, let me point out something. The NTSB does not simply come up with these recommendations based on a whim. It's not the flavor of the day. It's a data-driven approach based on the results of our investigations and the tragic and senseless deaths that we investigate. The NTSB's Most Wanted list, it is written in blood. Today, if today is like any other day in America, an entire room full of people will lose their lives in transportation tragedies. But these recommendations on the Most Wanted list that we're highlighting today, if acted upon, will result in safer transportation, and that is why we are here today. In just a moment, Chris O'Neill will moderate a panel with the board members based on the Most Wanted list. But before doing that, let me issue a call to action. We at the NTSB, we can go out and speak on these issues, and We, when invited, we can go in and testify to legislative bodies and to Congress, but we have no power to act on our own. We're counting on the industry. We're counting on advocates. We're counting on the government to act on our recommendations. We're counting on the help of the broader safety community. We're counting on you. It's up to you to implement these recommendations. I have long been inspired by a saying that says that whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved an entire world. Whoever saves a life, it is as if he has saved an entire world. It's up to you. Go out and save that one life. And if you do that, you will save an entire world. Thank you very much. Thank you for being here. Chris, I turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Chairman. So our 2019-2020 Most Wanted list is indeed a call to action. There are 267 open NTSB safety recommendations associated with this list. In the next 2 years, the NTSB wants 46 of those recommendations implemented, done, benefiting the traveling public. The items on the 2019-2020 Most Wanted list of transportation safety improvements are the critical changes needed to reduce transportation accidents, injuries, and fatalities. So let's talk about our list. At the top of our list, which is not rank ordered, is eliminate distractions. Vice Chairman Landsberg, there are 12 open safety recommendations designed to eliminate distraction, and those 12 recommendations touch on each mode of transportation. The NTSB is calling for 3 of these to be implemented within the next 2 years. Can you talk to us a little bit about the threat of distraction in transportation safety and what it means for us all?
Thank you, Chris. Who's carrying a cell phone today? I better see every hand in the room up, unless you're under a rock somewhere. As the chairman has mentioned, we have over 10,000 injuries every year and 3,000 fatalities. And that's happened every year for the last 4. Do you think these are underreported, perhaps?
Yes.
Do you think they're underreported? Yeah. I mean, if you've been in an accident, you're probably not going to turn state's evidence and say, "Oop, officer, I was talking on my cell phone." So how much more likely are you to have an accident when you're using a handheld cell phone?
About 4 times.
That's exactly right. Is the normal, what the cars carry?
Bluetooth?
Bluetooth and so forth, are they any better? No, they're not. And you might ask why, and that's because the problem doesn't lie here with your hand. It's with your head, because you are cognitively engaged, or at least most of us are, when we're having a conversation with somebody. Texting, how much worse is that? Simple answer, a lot. The studies that we have go anywhere between 4 and 20 times worse, more likely to have a crash in that regard. We've mentioned that we have recommendations to the rail, bus, and trucking companies, and they really should be banning the use of these devices except for navigation. And to CATIA, the Wireless Association, and the Consumer Electronics Group, you gotta love them, because they're the ones that got us into this circumstance. They can also help to get us out if we say, okay, you can use your cell phone, but only as a passenger, not while you're operating the vehicle. You know, we try to fix human nature here, but that's really hard. We are sort of who we are, and there are always going to be people who listen to our recommendations, and some perhaps not so much. For the states, we really need to have good, smart laws. There needs to be solid enforcement, And finally, we need to do a lot more education to raise the stigma of being distracted while you're operating a vehicle to the same level as we do with drunk driving.
Bruce, did you say that I didn't hear it, maybe you did you say that we need laws as well?
I did say that.
Yeah, good, and the NTSB has called for that. We've called for a ban on the use of non-emergency use of portable electronic devices.
I knew that.
Very good.
Thank you.
Very good.
You know, I didn't know you were going to be pop quizzing the staff there, sir.
We know him. He does that.
Is there, Vice Chairman, I think, you know, you're hitting on a theme that I think is really at the heart of the issue here. So this, you know, I'm using my portable device right now because I know it has accurate time.
Yeah, but you're not driving anything.
It is, but that's the challenge, right? So this is like so become part of everybody's life. People actually go into physical withdrawal when they can't get on their portable devices. Are we at a stage where we need to separate the device from the driving, much as we want to separate drinking from driving?
I think that's a rhetorical question, Chris. Absolutely. You know, multitasking does what? Two things. It makes you stupid, one, and it makes you dangerous, two. And again, as the chairman has mentioned, we don't make these numbers up. These are factual, evidence-based recommendations. And you know, the temptation is very strong when the phone goes off. You're running a business, you want to talk to somebody, but think about how your life is going to change if you cause a serious or fatal accident. The cost of that is going to be phenomenal, and when you look at it in retrospect, it's not a good trade-off.
Panelists, any other thoughts on eliminate distractions before we move through the list? Good discussion, thank you. So our next item on the list is end alcohol and other drug impairment. This item has been on the most wanted list since its inception, since 1990. Every year. There are two that we are calling for implementation within the next 2 years. Member Homendy, could you help us understand why the NTSB is so focused on this issue?
The chairman mentioned at the start of this that a third of all highway fatalities are the result of impaired driving. But I want to break that down a little bit more. I got here this morning at about 9 a.m., and by the time I leave, 2 people will have died as a result of impaired driving, and 66 others will have been injured. For us, those deaths and those injuries are 100% preventable. In 2013, we issued a safety study on reaching zero, and as part of that study, we issued a number of recommendations that include boosting high visibility enforcement, sobriety checks. We recommended requiring ignition interlocks for all offenders and reducing blood alcohol concentration limits from 0.08 to 0.05. But looking beyond highways, we also have a number of recommendations on drug impairment in commercial operations, and I want to talk about that for a second since those numbers are on the rise. We have recommendations on who should be tested, and our recommendations are all safety-sensitive personnel should be tested. For railroads, mechanics aren't required to be tested, but in transit, they are. And beyond just who should be tested, what they should be tested for, we believe that the panel for testing should be expanded. And then how they should be tested. Right now, DOT requirements are for urinalysis and some blood testing post-accident for FRA, but there are other methods for testing that should be considered and adopted, including oral fluids testing and hair testing. And then finally, we need education for the workforce and for the general public about the dangers of driving with medication. So it's not just illicit drugs, but also licit drugs as well.
Two things in your remarks there that I thought were telling, and then the first was the need to spread our strategy across several different approaches. It's not just about enforcement, it's not just about interlocks, it's about a multi-pronged strategy. I wonder, as the legalization of marijuana continues to become more and more popular, how do we use that multi-layered approach to face the challenges that come with increasing use of marijuana and its use by people who are operating vehicles?
Well, obviously, that's certainly a concern. I mean, right now, people are dying on our nation's roads. I was looking at the statistics over the weekend, and it's in 2016, over 200 children under the age of 14 died from impairment, whether it's drugs or alcohol on our nation's roads. And again, those are 100% preventable. For drug impairment, the NTSB has recommended standardized protocols so that states know when to test, what they're testing for, a minimum set of drugs, and cutoff levels for reporting. We definitely need better data. And then in addition to that, we need, as I mentioned, public education.
Panelists, any other further thoughts on ending impairment?
I have a question. In terms of, it seems like we're coming up constantly with new drugs and different ways of impairment. Are the testing protocols that are mandated, are they keeping up with that?
I mean, there are a lot of drugs that we're not testing for. The Department of Transportation added for opioids last year to the testing panel, but prior to that, the 5 classes of medications that are being tested for are really the same 5 that has existed since 1989, and we have to move beyond that. It is difficult as drugs are constantly changing and the formulas are constantly changing, but there are a number of medications that we aren't currently testing for that have a significant effect on both the driving public and then in commercial operations.
Well, you're exactly right, Jennifer, and we saw that in a crash in Davis, Oklahoma, where the driver of a truck, an 18-wheeler, had been using synthetic marijuana, or something called spice or K2, and as you pointed out, they figure out what the drug screening can't test for, and they use that. And as soon as the drug screeners figure out how to test for that, then they change the formula by changing something that. So this is a problem.
Thank you. Next on the most wanted list is ensure safe shipment of hazardous materials. Chairman Sumwalt, you'll be championing this most wanted list item, which has the most safety recommendations associated with it, 45 in all. 5 of those we want to see completed and implemented by the end of 2020. Chairman, can you tell us a little bit about what's the threat to transportation safety, how concerned should people be, and what is it that the NTSB wants to see done?
Well, Chris, really we've got to look at it in two aspects. We're looking at a couple of modes of transportation. One is rail, the other is pipeline. With respect to pipeline, 2.5 million miles of pipeline in the United States. That's a lot of pipeline. And of course, it's delivering, pipelines are delivering essential commodities to homes, to businesses, industries, gasoline, crude oil, natural gas, anhydrous ammonia, and a lot of other things. So what we would like to see, we've called for the installation of remote shutoff valves and automatic shutoff valves so that if there is a leak, that leak can be shut off very quickly. We've seen this in a number of accidents. We want improved inline inspection to improve the likelihood of detecting a defect in the pipeline. The incorporation of hydrostatic testing, that is being used in some cases, but we determined that there's an exemption, a grandfather. Anything before 1970 was a grandfather, not required to have a hydrostatic test. We want improved public awareness campaigns. The people need to know what commodities are being shipped in pipeline in their communities. And the emergency responders need to know that as well. So that's it as far as pipeline. As far as rail, there's things I could talk about with rail, but I'll give you the chance to ask another question before I get into that.
So
I have a question.
Please.
We just recently had a board meeting about a tank car derailment in Grattinger, Iowa. And if you can spell that, you can look it up. But they were shipping ethanol, and the good news, if there is any good news, was the fact that it was regular ethanol as opposed to denatured. You remember our conversation. And the fact that the fire and explosion that seems to be inevitable with these things was far less, and the environmental damage was far less. So didn't we make a recommendation out of that?
Yes, we did. We made a recommendation to PHMSA to evaluate the possible safety benefits of shipping ethanol without the denaturant.
And the denaturant, they put gasoline or other things in it, and the reason for this, I think, goes back to prohibition, doesn't it? It keeps people from drinking this stuff. And a question that I had was, have we ever had a tank car hijacked? And I believe the staff said we hadn't. If you can handle 17,000 gallons of this stuff in one sitting, good for you. But it seems like we could, in this one case, is make some improvements just by changing the nature of what we're shipping.
Well, and we certainly hope that PHMSA will follow up with our recommendation and conduct a study of that. And since you mentioned that was a tank car, the tank cars that were involved in that, the interesting thing is that ethanol is significantly more volatile than crude oil. And yet, in the FAST Act that set in place a phase-out schedule for the use of the DOT 111 tank cars and the CPC 1232 tank cars, it required phasing out crude oil for transportation in these vehicles, these tank cars. Crude oil could no longer be shipped in the DOT 111s last year. But ethanol, which is more volatile, has until 2023 to be phased out for the DOT 111 tank cars. So I know that's the law, but we would encourage the shippers to make that switch to the improved DOT 117 and 117R tank cars.
Panelists, any other thoughts? Excellent. Our next item on the most wanted list is to fully implement positive train control. We've been advocating for positive train control for almost as long as the NTSB has been in existence. Member Homendy, it sounds like we're getting very close to the finish line, but there's still work left to be done. I wonder if you could tell us where we're at with the implementation of PTC.
Well, I would tell you more, but the most recent data we have actually is from the third quarter of last year. DOT has not yet released the fourth quarter information. What we do know is that we are closer to installation, but there's a big difference between installation and being operational with PTC and interoperable with the other railroads. And we are a bit of ways away from that, unfortunately. And I just want to go back a little bit in time. Last year, the chairman mentioned that we were on the scene today in Casey, South Carolina for an accident, a PTC preventable accident where an Amtrak train was diverted onto a siding due to a misaligned switch and hit a parked CSX train, and 2 crew members unfortunately died. And I always talk about this, but in 1961, President Kennedy set a goal to put a man on the moon by the end of the decade. And in July 1969, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin did that. 1 month later, we investigated our first PTC preventable accident in Darien, Connecticut. Over the course of 50 years, we have investigated 150 PTC preventable accidents that have caused 303 fatalities and 6,800 injuries. So in 5 decades, we were able to put a man on the moon, but we haven't been able to implement PTC. That's not acceptable. The risk today for a PTC accident is the same as it was 50 years ago and a year ago when we investigated the accident in Casey. And so that's the concern going forward.
Panelists, anything else we want to add on PTC?
I think it's a good idea.
Indeed. So let's move on to our next item on the most wanted list, a strategy to reduce speeding-related crashes. Chairman, I think you said it really succinctly when you said speed kills. I think we've all heard that before, but it needs to be said again, and apparently said again, and said one more time. Speed, a factor in more than 10,000 deaths on our nation's roads each year. Highway crashes accounted for 95% of the people who perished in transportation accidents in 2017. It makes clear the need to implement a comprehensive strategy. We have 21 open safety recommendations relating to this issue area, and the NTSB wants to see 7 of those recommendations implemented by the end of 2020. Member Homendy, how is the issue of speeding different from, say, that of impaired driving?
So it's not that different, which is probably surprising to a lot of people. 10,000 people die on our nation's roads annually from impairment. 10,000 people, a little over 10,000 people die from speeding-related crashes. The difference is people don't see it as a risk. I drive 60 miles to work every day on I-95, and I think I'm the slowest person in the right-hand lane, and I'm doing the speed limit. Most people are doing 75, 80, 85, and are not thinking about it. And that's the problem. We do need a national campaign like we have for Click It or Ticket or some of the others to raise awareness of the problem with speeding. Speeding increases your risk of being in a crash and increases the risk of dying and having a serious injury. So it's something that we believe really needs to be addressed and really highlighted and brought forward as a priority.
Panelists, any other thoughts?
What would it take to fix it?
Well, we did a study in 2017 on reducing speeding-related crashes. We identified 49 major accidents on the highways that we investigated that we felt were caused by speeding or speeding contributed to them. And that's just 49 that we investigated, not other federal agencies and state agencies that investigated those, including a major bus crash that occurred in 2011 in New York. And that motor coach was carrying 32 people, 15 people died, 17 others were injured. And that driver was operating that vehicle at 78 miles per hour. The speed limit in that zone was 50. So we recommended a number of measures in our speed study in 2017, which includes increased enforcement, like automated speed enforcement or point-to-point education, like I mentioned, and national education, a comprehensive education campaign to prioritize speeding, and, for example, technology like speed limiters for heavy vehicles and motor coaches and buses, just to name a few.
You know, in terms of enforcement for speeding, we hear a lot in the media or a lot in social media about the use of speed cameras and other electronics to enforce speed limits. The technology is clearly out there. There are a number of ways, point-to-point enforcement, the speed cameras. There are a number of ways to enforce speed limits. What seems to be the hindrance in broader acceptance of those technologies?
Well, some states actually prevent using those technologies for speed enforcement. So we have recommended that those states allow the use of those technologies and that they'd be used to a greater extent. And I will say it's not just the NTSB that is focusing on speeding. I'm very happy that GHSA and some other organizations are also focused on speeding, and we look forward to working with our partners to move this forward.
Excellent. Thank you. Our next item on the most wanted list is improve Part 135 aircraft flight operation safety. Chairman Sumwalt, you discussed in your opening remarks the need for a single high standard of safety in aviation as the driver for adding this item to the most wanted list. There are 21 open safety recommendations associated with this item, and we believe that 3 can and should be implemented within the next 2 years. These recommendations talk about flight data monitoring and safety management system programs. I was wondering if you could, for those unfamiliar, briefly define what are Part 135 operations and how would these data monitoring and safety management systems improve flight safety?
Well, Chris, thanks for that question. I think I did say this in my opening remarks. A number of Part 135 operators do operate with a high level of safety, so I don't want to diminish that point. But we have investigated crashes that have killed people, paying passengers, and crew members. And as a result of those investigations, we have found that there's ways that these Part 135 operators could improve. Back to what I said earlier, what is 135? It would be air charter, it would be air taxi, it would be air medical flights, it would be, what else is it, Chris?
Sightseeing. Air tours.
Actually, air tours are oftentimes conducted under Part 91 if it's conducted within 25 miles of the departure airport.
The loophole.
The loophole. But whatever it is, we feel that a paying passenger should have the same level of safety as they would if they were to go get on a commercial airliner. They don't understand the difference. The passengers don't understand the difference. They're paying money. They think they can go out and just, yeah, this is going to be safe. So, safety management system, SMS, safety management systems, they are required for Part 121 operators. Basically, this is a system of managing safety the way that we manage other vital business functions. And you want to assess your risk. This is one of the key components of safety management system. Before you do something, you look at the risk and you say, are the risks acceptable? Is the level of risk acceptable? If not, let's put controls on that risk. Let's figure out how we can lower the risk to an acceptable level. That's what the major airlines are doing. That's what the Part 121 carriers are doing these days. It should be done for Part 135. Now, again, some of them are doing it, but we feel that it should be done by all 135 operators. Flight data monitoring. The airlines for a couple of decades now have been monitoring their flights. You know, we at the NTSB talk about black boxes. Well, we use those for crash investigations. There's a plethora of data that comes from normal flights, from routine flights, from flights every day. Don't wait for a crash to see that something went wrong. Look at your routine flight operations and see where the deviations are, where the exceedances are. And that's what the airlines are doing. Airlines should be, Part 135 should be doing that as well. We want to point out that both SMS and flight data monitoring can be scalable for the size of the operation. And finally, we've seen a number of control flight into terrain accidents with Part 135 operators. Part 121 carriers are required to have CFIT training. Part 135 airplane operators are not required to have it. 135 helicopters are required to have it, however. So the bottom line is, we would like there to be an equivalent level of safety, regardless of whether somebody is paying to ride on an airliner, Part 121 airliner, or a Part 135 operation.
Panelists, further thoughts? Let's move right into our next item then. Increase implementation of collision avoidance technologies. So as consumers, I think we feel bombarded with advertisements for vehicles with driver assist technologies, automatic emergency braking. I think I heard last year Cadillac had an ad that talked about truly hands-free driving. We're not there yet. But there are great benefits in technology that assist us in the driving function, such as automatic emergency braking, lane keeping, and other safety features. At the same time we hear about these, we hear about the testing of autonomous vehicles in various cities around the country. Member Weener, I wonder if you could tell us why then is the issue of increased implementation of collision avoidance systems on our most wanted list?
Well, it was mentioned in the chairman's opening remarks. In 2017, there were approximately 39,000 fatalities in transportation, and about 37,000 of those are automotive or highway motor vehicles. So obviously, this is a target area that's very rich. The NTSB is investigating several autonomous automobile or nearly autonomous automobile accidents. What I'm addressing here is not that. What I'm addressing is that technology which is currently available that you can buy off the shelf, should be as standard equipment in most of the automobiles. We've been talking about several ways of addressing the operation and improving safety. So that addresses distractions, fatigue, impairment, and so forth. We learned from the aviation successes in terms of safety that if you can inculcate it in technology, you stand a chance of having gains and keeping the gains. It's much more difficult to train the human being to do something different. They're quite resilient. They like to come back to their overlearned behaviors. The technology we're talking about has been a subject of NTSB focus for more than 25 years, well, more than 20 years. Back in 1995, the NTSB did a study of forward collision warning systems and called for implementation and development of standards, design standards. That was followed up by a study in 2015, which looked at the successor to forward collision warning systems, that being automatic emergency braking. So when you take the suite of technologies, automatic emergency braking, lane keeping, forward collision warning systems, blind spot monitoring, and so forth, those are all technologies which are available. In the 2018-2019 automobiles, about a third of them were delivered with these kinds of technologies available. That means 2/3 weren't. There is an agreement between NHTSA, the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety, IIHS, and approximately 20 automobile manufacturers to include these systems as standard in 2022 vehicles. Just to get a better feel for this, I bought an automobile recently that has these technologies in it, and they're remarkable in many ways. But one of the disappointments in a way was the tendency to sell you the car, let you drive it off the lot, and put a minimum amount of time into explaining what these technologies are, what they can do, and probably as important as what they can do is what they can't do, because it's the limitations on these systems that when violated can get one into real trouble. So we're focusing on getting these systems in the vehicles, implemented and educated. And last but not least is, as I said, 1/3 of the vehicles coming off the production line nowadays have these technologies, but about 15% of the trucks being delivered have this capability. So we've had a number of heavy truck accidents that would have been prevented by this kind of technology applied to those vehicles. Standards need to be developed for the heavy trucks. But all in all, it's a technology which set of technologies which can really improve safety.
Jennifer, when we were talking about this a few days ago, you and I were, and you had a great saying about.
Yeah, I mean, I'm currently looking for a vehicle, and the one I'm looking at, it costs $6,000 more to get safety technology. So our view is that we don't believe safety should be a luxury. It should be standard in all equipment, so in all vehicles. So
Safety should not be a luxury.
That's right.
I love it. Write that down.
It should be standard.
use my name, not.
So our next item on the most wanted list is something else I think we can all relate to. Who stayed up for the game last night? Oh, come on, I don't know, there had to be more than me. I mean, it wasn't, like edge of your seat kind of game, but it was a game, right? So, and then you follow that up with getting up early to do the National Capital Region commute. And then maybe if you were like me and had to be here, you got up just a little bit earlier. And so around about 2 or 3 o'clock this afternoon, I'm really going to start feeling it. Unfortunately for me, I get to ride the train back and forth to work every day, but I still got to get from the train stop to the house. Fatigue, it's just pervasive. People walk around perpetually sleep deprived and don't realize it, or they have medical issues that affect their sleep and they don't realize it. It's something I think all of us can relate to, that when you get those head nods and you know it's time to stop and get out of the vehicle and get some rest or get some air. There are 42 NTSB safety recommendations associated with this item, and we are focused on seeing 6 of them implemented within the next 2 years. Vice Chairman Landsberg, these 6 recommendations touch each mode of transportation. I notice how your issue area spans all the modes of transportation. You volunteer for that?
I think it comes with being one of the new people on the block here. But anyway, fatigue affects all of us, but especially teens. Anybody have teens at home that are driving? Yeah. And shift workers. Teens, it's recommended that they get 8 to 10 hours of sleep a night. I don't know of many teens, nor do I remember in my own youth being able to do that. They're up when they're not supposed to be, and they're down when they're not supposed to be, and they're also addicted to the cell phones and so forth, and you put them in a vehicle, and that is a lethal situation. For shift workers, Robert, when you were flying airplanes, most of the time you got to where you were going about midnight or 1 o'clock, and you didn't start again until about 5 or 6 sometimes, unless you were new on the seniority list, and certainly the freight pilots, cargo pilots are flying. But that period from midnight until 6 o'clock is where we start to talk about the circadian low, and that's where we should be sleeping, but we don't. We've made recommendations to the FAA relative to the maintenance people, because once we as pilots have broken the airplanes, the maintenance people need to fix them, and they need to fix them right, and we have instances of where that hasn't happened. So that's really important. As far as recommendations to the Federal Motor Carrier Administration and the Federal Railway Administration, we've got a lot of science to back these things up. They need to be looking at the hours that people are working on shifts and so forth, and we need to be very, very cognizant of the circadian low.
Speaking of data, do you know, or do you have the figures for how big of a factor fatigue is in transportation accidents? Can we quantify the threat to the traveling public?
We can. As near as we can tell, 90,000 crashes a year, 30,000 injuries, at least 800 fatalities, and I would say, once again, like distraction, these are vastly underreported. And
if I could add, the FRA is currently working on fatigue management plans for rail workers. That was a requirement in the 2008 Rail Safety Improvement Act and came from several NTSB recommendations for railroads to develop fatigue management plans. It has been 11 years and it's nowhere closer to being finalized.
It's not an obscure science. The fatigue risk management plans have been in force in aviation for quite a number of years already. And fatigue can be managed.
So we link medical conditions with fatigue in some cases, which brings us to our next issue on the most wanted list, medical fitness and screening for obstructive sleep apnea. There are 15 open safety recommendations associated with this item. Require medical fitness and screen for obstructive sleep apnea. The NTSB wants to see 1/3 of these implemented in the next 2 years. Vice Chairman Landsberg, will stay with you, and can you tell us why screening for OSA is so important?
Well, I think the thing about OSA, again, it seems like so many of these crashes are underreported. People don't know that they're not sleeping well. I would venture to say that a number of us in here may snore, although we would never admit to it, but our sleep partner might know that. This is something that can be dealt with. On the aviation side, we've put a lot of emphasis on this, and we think that you know, in the other areas, particularly in surface transportation, this can be a lot better. We've investigated a number of accidents in the trucking and bus industries where somebody has just plain fallen asleep, and afterwards it's been revealed that the person had sleep apnea. The other area I want to talk about is sudden incapacitations, which involve heart problems, epilepsy, diabetes, and so forth, and finally getting back to drugs and impairment there. And we've talked about illicit, but over-the-counter medications. I have one word for you. It's not plastics. It's diphenhydramine. And you may not know it as that, but you know it in many other areas, such as NyQuil, Benadryl, Advil PM, Robitussin, Tylenol PM. These are all drugs that we take typically for cold symptoms or blood pressure medications or other kinds of things. Diphenhydramine is in all of them, and it is very definitely impairing. You have a label on the container that tells you that it's impairing, and what do people do? They pretty much ignore it. And if you take some of this stuff at night, it's good, it works. I speak with authority on the topic. I had a flight scheduled, was on the back end of a cold, took one of the night medicines, and woke up the next morning. I was feeling pretty good. But I was very relaxed, more so than normal, and said, you know, this isn't my normal condition. I think I'm going to stand down from this flying. In aviation, we recommend 5 times the dosing interval. So if it's an 8-hour dose, you should be waiting about a day and a half before you start to fly. And again, this shows up in our toxicology reports after we do the accident situation. So something we need to do a lot more education on.
I think a study that we did not too long back indicated about 8% of the fatally injured pilots over a 22-year period were impaired by diphenhydramine, or likely impaired by diphenhydramine. It's interesting, I first came across diphenhydramine when I was moving a couple of dogs cross country in the, under the seat in front of you.
Was it for the dogs or for you?
Well, in order to make the trip more pleasant for me, I asked the vet, how do you get him to relax and enjoy the journey, so to speak? And his comment was, you feed him a little Benadryl. That'll calm him down. And that was much better for me, too.
Vice Chairman, one of the other issues that are associated with this issue area, the medical fitness part, so I think the average traveler would be surprised to find out that there isn't the same level of medical screening across all modes of transportation. In other words, the medical standards that have to be met by a pilot might not be the same as a truck driver, which might not be the same as someone in a safety-sensitive position in rail or someone in the marine industry. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, that's absolutely true. Aviation, from private pilot on up through airline transport pilot, we have increasingly stringent requirements and medical certification and so forth. That doesn't exist to the same level across the other modes. And I think certainly if you're paying for transportation or you're on the receiving end of it, you want to make sure that those people that are out on the roads on a regular basis have got that level of certification. The Coast Guard does a pretty good job on the marine side of things, but even in that, we get into the whole business. All of my areas seem to sort of overlap between fatigue and distraction and fitness, and you can't isolate any one of them. And so we really should be looking at, let's deal with the problems. We know what the problems are. We know how to fix them. Let's do it.
And so with that momentum, we'll go right into item 10, occupant protection. The NTSB is renowned for its safety recommendations to help prevent accidents, to stop them before they happen, before they have a chance to injure and kill. Yet this item is very much focused on minimizing the injuries and the fatalities once an accident happens. Remember, Weener, can you tell us what the NTSB wants to see done in this issue area?
Well, let me preface it by saying, first, it's much more important to prevent an accident than it is to deal with the aftermath. So the occupant protection does, in fact, address the aftermath. And it really, in my mind, I simplify it, if you will, by saying the first thing you need to do is provide the survival space. Then you make sure that the occupant stays in that survivable space, and you protect them within that space. Now, let me address each of those briefly. When I talk about keeping survival space, that means the design has to be such that in an impact or a mishap or an incident, that the space for the occupant doesn't get intruded to the point where that becomes the injury. For buses, for example, we're emphasizing the roof strength, side strength, crashworthiness, energy absorption, dissipation, and so forth. As far as keeping the occupant within that space, something as straightforward as seat belts, lap and shoulder belts, have been remarkably effective in preventing fatalities. Now, that also includes making certain that the children are in an age-appropriate car seat, and that may mean that kids have car seats all the way up to 8 years old. As far as protecting you, once you've had this, been restrained into the survival space, you have to make sure that there aren't loose things that become projectiles in an impact, in a crash, and that the space has appropriate padding to avoid injury. So that, in a nutshell, is occupant protection. It's a factor in all modes of transportation, not just automobiles, but trains, buses, cars, etc.
Sir, you mentioned the need to protect people within that space. One of the issues, one of the 9 safety recommendations that we want to see implemented in the next 2 years deals with fuel system crash resistance. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and how it relates to occupant protection.
Well, due to a loophole, if you will, in the regulations for helicopters, current production of helicopters does not necessarily include a crash-worthy fuel system. We've had several investigations where the helicopter in a crash, the crash itself was survivable, but because of the frangibility of the fuel system, there was a fuel-fed fire afterwards, and that then led to the fatalities. So there have been recommendations for crash-worthy fuel systems. The military helicopters do generally have crash-worthy fuel systems, but the civilian helicopters don't always do that. So that's an area of emphasis.
Thank you, sir. Panelists, that brings us to the end of our 10 items on the most wanted list. Do you have any final thoughts before we move into a question and answer session?
I have 2. Oh, go ahead.
Come here.
Okay. 2 things I wanted to mention, circling back to what the chairman said at the beginning, is we can't do this alone. There are a lot of stakeholders in the room. There are some online and others, and we need your help in order to implement these recommendations and others. And the second thing I want to mention is just because something is not in our most wanted list that we're showing today does not mean it's not important to us. We have 1,200 open safety recommendations, and we are working to implement all of those. We are just as dedicated to those as we are to the ones that are listed here. So I just wanted to mention that.
I've got a couple of thoughts. First off, I think we're dealing with human nature. Nobody plans to have a crash. We wouldn't get in any vehicle if we thought it was going to be dangerous. So the non-existent invisible shield surrounds all of us. So we need to be thinking about, yeah, it can happen to us. Joseph Stalin infamously said, one death is a tragedy, thousands are a statistic. And we're quoting a lot of statistics here, but every one of us knows somebody or perhaps have been affected by it ourselves. Somebody who was lost on the highways, a family member, a friend, or a coworker. So the chairman has addressed this in our opening. So this is a very real problem. And I guess the final thought that I have is safety isn't everything. It's the only thing.
Chairman? Nope. Well, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our panel discussion. We'll open up the floor for a question and answer. We have microphones available from Terry and Keith. If you'd like to ask a question, please wait for the microphone to get to you. Again, please tell us who you are, who you're with, and who on the panel your question is for. Who wants to go first? See some hands over here.
Yes. Good morning.
That's all right. Just speak.
Okay. Good morning. My name is Veronica Davis. I'm a co-owner of a company called Inspire Green. And we worked on the Vision Zero action plan for the District of Columbia, the City of Alexandria, and currently working with Montgomery County, Maryland. I also am on, for American Society of Civil Engineers, I'm on the Transportation Policy Committee, to which we now have a Vision Zero policy. And so in all this conversation, I really haven't heard much about really our roadway design. That is our biggest kind of thing that we can do to make our roadways safer. Enforcement and education are a piece of the pie, but we know that we can design safer roadways. However, one of the challenges is that we have all of these regulations that are conflicting with each other. Because if we try to take out a lane of traffic to make it safer and narrow the roadway, then you sometimes bump up against the NEPA process and the concern that you're now creating traffic congestion. But at some point, we have to say people shouldn't die. And if people are delayed 5 minutes or 2 minutes, whatever, that's okay. So I just wanted to hear some of your thoughts on that.
Well, thank you for your comments. We have over 1,200 recommendations that are open, and we have addressed roadway design and somewhere in those recommendations. But the focus of this year's, the 2019-2020 Most Wanted list is to look for those areas and put emphasis on those areas that we can get closed out in the next 2 years. So thank you for your comments.
Who's next? Where's the microphone? Yes, sir.
Yeah, John Wetmore with pedestrians.org. Which of these areas would have an impact on pedestrian safety where we've been seeing fatalities going up in recent years?
Pedestrian safety, did I hear that correctly?
Yes, pedestrian safety.
Well, I think a lot of them would. I think speeding certainly would, impairment, distraction, drugs, all of those things. So we've got we just completed a study on pedestrians too, did we not?
We did. Completed a study on pedestrian safety in September, I believe it was. It was September the 25th, and we found that over a recent decade, pedestrian fatalities have increased 28%, while overall highway fatalities have decreased by about 14%. So it is an issue that we're very interested in. We had a number of recommendations to hopefully improve pedestrian fatality. Did you know that nearly 6,000 people in this country die each year, pedestrians? Nearly 6,000.
And part of the challenge too, as we found, is the distraction and impairment. We've been focusing on the operators of vehicles, but that applies to pedestrians as well. So if the pedestrian is impaired or they're distracted, that can contribute to the problem.
Another question? Yes, sir.
Ashley Halsey from the Washington Post. I've got a couple of questions that sound related, but perhaps are not. One is distraction enforcement. One of the things that was mentioned earlier was that people are allowed to use them for purposes of navigation. When my guess would be that if somebody is using their cell phone for nefarious purposes, they are going to tell the officer who stops them, gee, I was using it for Waze, I was using it for navigation. So the question is, what is the level of enforcement? What can we expect from police officers who are trying to enforce this law given the restrictions placed on them? Second question is about state legislatures. Will state legislatures step up and pass, in your estimation, the speed camera laws that would put speed cameras on state highways and perhaps even on the federal interstates?
I'll take the first one. As a Waze or navigation user myself, I find the equipment to be tremendously helpful when it is programmed and I'm going to where I think I'm going to. Reprogramming the equipment is problematic, and some of the devices will not let you reprogram while you are in motion. So I think, as we mentioned earlier, the technology can really help us in this regard and protect us against some of our baser instincts. I'm also told that there's some technology that will allow police officers to very quickly determine sort of what you were doing on your phone. I don't know enough about that to really comment intelligently, but I think we're going to learn a lot more in those areas. But human nature being what it is, I'd like to be optimistic. I think we need to educate people on these matters and say, look, you're impaired when you're distracted. But that's going to take us a little while.
Actually, on speeding, we certainly work with our state partners on implementing all our recommendations. I think one of the most recent successes was on impairment, where Utah adopted legislation to reduce BAC limits from 0.08 to 0.05. So we've had a lot of successes on the state level, and I think we will on speeding as well, particularly since some of our state partners have been out there on speeding. So when we talk about education, education is not just for the public, but also for the state legislatures, which is our job, and others that we'll work with and doing over the next couple of years.
I want to say something about distractions too. I want to be very clear that, as Bruce pointed out, the difference, the crash risk between doing this, holding it to your ear, versus Bluetooth or hands-free, there is basically no difference in crash risk. So I believe that lawmakers and policymakers that are passing laws to outlaw handheld, but not addressing hands-free, I believe they are sending the wrong message. They are sending the message that one is safer than the other, and that is not true. The NTSB has called for an outright ban on the non-emergency use of these because, as Bruce pointed out, the cognitive distraction.
Sir?
Jonathan Salant, New Jersey Advanced Media. We're talking about positive train control, and the race to implement the deadline has primarily been a race, in certain cases, just to get the extra 2-year extension to meet the deadline. What's your concern in the fact that we still have not close to getting positive train control, and are you worried that Congress will give them another 2 years in the next 2 years?
Well, certainly we would urge that that not happen. It shouldn't have happened in the first place. The initial deadline was December 31st, 2015. It was extended to 2018, and now pretty much all of them are going to apply for up to an additional 2 years. As I mentioned, the risk of a PTC preventable accident is no different today than when Congress passed the Rail Safety Improvement Act back in 2008. And so, you know, from our perspective, it needs to be addressed very quickly.
Relative to football, since we've just gotten off the football thing, it's sort of equivalent of moving the goalposts.
Sir?
Excuse me, Dave Shepherdson from Reuters. Two questions. Chairman Sumwalt, how long or how much of a delay in the pending investigations do you think the government shutdown will have?
Well, it will have a substantial impact, and it will depend on on that particular investigation. You've got to understand that we have ongoing investigations and ongoing accidents. So when our investigators walked back in the door last Monday morning, there was a backlog on top of what they were already working on, instead of being able to address it on a day-to-day basis. So there will be investigations that the target dates will slide. And as I said earlier, it's tragic that family members are going to have to wait even further. I had an email sent to me about 10 days ago from somebody whose relative was killed in a plane crash. She was pleading for answers. And painfully, I had to say, we cannot investigate this one until the government is reopened.
And you mentioned 37,000 of the 39,000 deaths every year are highway-related. A number of your recommendations are human behavior, you know, distraction, fatigue, alcohol, speeding. Do you think, sort of in the medium to long term, is the answer going to be fully self-driving cars, or do you think regulators have to take more aggressive steps to prevent the bad behavior in the first place, either through interlocks or banning cell phones or other actions?
Well, here's what I really want to focus on, Dave, is I want to focus on the most wanted list for the next 2 years. That's what we want to see done. We want to see, because we've not tried to bite off everything in the universe. We've tried to really narrow this down into how many recommendations are we looking to implement over the next 2 years?
46, sir.
46. So that's really what our focus is right now.
See a question over up front here?
Hi, I'm Jerry Zaremski from the Buffalo News, and I have a question for Chairman Sumwalt, and it's kind of reflecting on what appears to be a transportation safety success, and that is the fact that in the last decade, aviation safety seems to have improved quite a bit. Since a crash in Buffalo a year ago or 10 years ago next week. I was hoping you could reflect on that and give us some ideas as to why there have been really so few fatalities on American commercial airplanes in the last 10 years, and what the impact of the 2010 aviation safety law might have been.
Well, it's a really good question. And I will point out, as you did, that we've had an extraordinary safe record over the last decade. But I also want to point out that we did have one fatality on April the 17th, and one fatality is too many. So we have had a very good safety record, but we cannot let up at this point.
And what was the impact of the safety law in 2010?
Well,
Fatigue and all those other issues?
it was, it's hard to draw a correlation exactly to the passage of HB 111-216, but it did implement and inculcate many of the safety recommendations that the NTSB has had a long-standing concern about. It addressed how pilots fundamentally are selected, airline pilots are selected, how they are trained, how they maintain their proficiency. So it was a fatigue regulation. So it was broad sweeping, and we were glad to see that many of those recommendations were adopted. Thank you.
Right up front. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Eleanor Lamb, Transport Topics. I was wondering if you could talk about some of the recommendations that pertain specifically to freight haulers and truck drivers that can help address some of the issues listed here today, such as sleep apnea and collision avoidance technology.
I'll start with the sleep apnea. This is, as I think we're learning a lot more about it, and the fact that it can be very insidious. That people, they wake up, they're tired, they don't know why, and so forth. And what we've discovered is that it can be treated, but people have to do this. And I think if your livelihood depends upon your medical fitness, there's a fear amongst some of the people that, you know, if I have this problem, I'm going to lose my job. And I think generally the good news is, no, that's not the case. It can be treated successfully, and you'll be much safer as a result of it, as will everybody operating on the highways. So again, this goes to an education thing. It goes to you know, smart regulation, and it goes to education of the community at large, to the companies. Some of the companies, I think, are pretty proactive in dealing with this. And one of the things in aviation that we talk about is a non-punitive environment. The technical term is just culture, which is if somebody has a problem, identify it, that you had a problem and so forth. Let's not jump all over them. Let's help them to get it addressed.
One here and then one here.
I'd like to follow up on the distracted driving thing.
Can we get the microphone to this gentleman, please? Can we pass it up? Thank you. Yeah.
My name is Ron Weber, retired NTSB. I would like to follow up on the distracted driving problem, because I was involved in one last year. I was cited for improper lane change. I went to court. I proved it was a distracted driving, and the other person was guilty, and the case was dismissed. But one of the problems in enforcing that is you have to see the person, basically, and we have tinted windows. States vary in their, I don't know, tintation is a proper word, but the degree of tinting. So this was a Florida vehicle where they allow a much heavier tinting than they do, say, in Virginia, where I'm from. The person also had 2 young children in the back of the car, was speeding, trying to catch the auto train in Lawton to go down to Florida. There were no cops, police officers, excuse me, at the scene who witnessed the scene, so I was cited for unsafe lane change. Being from NTSB, investigating highway accidents most of my time there, my almost 30 years with NTSB, I did what you call a major accident study to try to beat my ticket, and I did. And I think some simple things to do is the tinted window should be eliminated on the driver's side. The aftermarket, you can do, seems anything aftermarket. Most of these people have something to hide. They want to use their cell phone that somebody can't observe. As a matter of fact, the only observational studies I've seen that I read about was observing someone at a stoplight or a stop sign. That's not a valid study, obviously, to project that. I see people all the time, they're making turns, left turns, one hand on the steering wheel and one hand and using their cell phone.
Well, excuse me, what is your question?
My question is, what can we do nationally? Is that one of your suggestions to eliminate, say, tinted windows? Make sure or try to get the states to change their laws on texting. Virginia finally came around to eliminate texting, but you can still use your cell phone, while the district...
We do not have a recommendation on tinted windows. Is there another question?
Well, I think you should.
Okay, good, thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Did you have a
Alan?
question? Sorry, I took you up, sorry.
Hi, thanks very much. Alan Levin with Bloomberg News. I realize, all 10 of the recommendations are important, but where's the biggest bang for the buck in terms of lives saved, the 1, 2, or 3 that on this list, in your opinion?
Well, my colleague Jennifer Homendy and I were talking about that just the other day, and she really put it into some nice buckets. Would you like to take that?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say you can't put a price on somebody's life, and you can't rank, we can't rank our most wanted list by who should be saved more than somebody else. All, you know, we believe all lives should be saved. So, you know, that ranking is not something that we can do.
But where would the most lives be saved if recommendations were accomplished in this list?
Go ahead.
Well, where are the most highway fatalities occurring? Impaired driving, speeding, distractions. We believe that a lot of other of these recommendations can not only prevent the accident or the crash, but can mitigate the impacts, literally the impacts of a crash, should one occur.
I have time for 2 more questions.
Thank you. Frank Jackman, Flight Safety Foundation. Chairman Sumwalt, does the item about safe shipment of hazardous materials, does that extend to aviation? And if so, do you have outstanding recommendations on that?
Frank, it does, and it does extend to aviation. And we have investigated accidents where the shipment of lithium batteries has been problematic. Now, we are, by design, if you look at our enabling legislation, we are pretty much an accident investigation agency. So our recommendations stem from accident investigations. So far, we have not had an aviation accident in the U.S. related to these iPhones getting squashed into seat backs and seats and things like that. Will that day occur? I hope not, but I'm fearful. But our main focus as it relates to aviation and the shipment of hazardous materials has been on the bulk shipment of lithium batteries.
And one final question. All right then. This completes our question and answer session for the Most Wanted List Kickoff event. Please stick around. We're going to debut the companion video to go with. I'll show up on the monitors here. If you have a need for one-on-ones or follow-up questions with any of our panelists, please get with myself, Eric, Terry, or Keith, and we'll make those arrangements for you. Please enjoy our video.
Every day, transportation disasters, large and small, affect families, businesses, and communities across our nation. Maybe even you have been affected. Every year, the NTSB issues hundreds of safety recommendations from our investigations of transportation disasters. Each recommendation we issue is important and often connected to a life forever changed. Each has the potential to shape the future of transportation and to save lives. Yet some accident and crash causes are so pervasive and recurring that we must focus a high level of effort on them, and they must be acted upon immediately. Our most wanted list of transportation safety improvements allows us to focus our advocacy efforts on the issue areas that we believe are primed for action and that can significantly improve transportation safety. Whether we are entering our vehicles, boarding vessels, planes, or trains, we have an expectation to arrive at our destination safely. Here at the NTSB, our mission, our purpose is improving transportation safety. As mentioned before, there are hundreds of recommendations we currently have open today. For the next 2 years, we will focus our efforts to improve these 10 transportation safety issue areas. This is our 2019-2020 Most Wanted list of critical changes needed to reduce transportation accidents and save lives. There is much more to discuss, and we need your help. Regulators, industry, and even you, the traveling public. We need your help to prevent disasters and save lives. Learn more about our Most Wanted list at ntsb.gov.
That concludes the formal portion of our event today. Again, if you're a journalist and have a desire to meet with one of our panelists, please see myself, Eric, Terry, or Keith, and we'll make that arrangement for you. All of the materials that we have here today, fact sheets, brochures, and our booklets are available at the reception area and are available online at ntsb.gov. Thank you.